Welcome to Fasken's 2022 mining series. This is our 12th consecutive series. I am Virginia Schweitzer, and I'm part of the Fasken Global Mining Group. It's such a pleasure to be here today and to introduce this session. Today's session is our fifth of 15 sessions, which continue until next Wednesday. Please refer to your slide on your screen for some housekeeping items at the end of the presentation. Now I will turn it over to my colleague, Vanessa, Henri, the moderator for Technological Risks and Cybersecurity in the Mining Industry on the Path to Strategic Risk Planning. And Vanessa will introduce today's panel. Over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Virginia. It's really a pleasure today to participate to this conference. We talk a lot about cybersecurity, but we don't often get the chance to talk about it in a very applied and specific manner. And we think that the mining industry is one of the area in which cybersecurity has a lot of particularities. So in order to cover these particularities, we thought that different perspective would probably work better. So we have I have three panelists, and I'm also going to give you a little bit of legal perspective, of course. Otherwise, why would you come to a legal seminar? But I'm very happy because I'm going to get to exchange with others that work in different areas. So Andy is a senior grid strategist at the Idaho National Lab. Andy, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Ran is the VP of Technical Research and Integration at aDolus Technology. And Ran has a non-expertise for OT matters, and I've seen him in many conferences before, so I'm happy we could talk about it together today. And also we have with us Jerome Farquharson, who's the Senior Managing Director, Governance, Risk Compliance, and Cybersecurity. I would say all of these things we're going to talk about today, so we're very happy to have you here. Welcome, everyone. So today we're going to talk, yes, about cybersecurity, and we know like it's all over the news. It has become a buzzword, but believe it or not, when most of us started our career, it was not. We were told probably we were nerds or the likes, but today cybersecurity is really something everybody knows about, something that we talk about it all the time. But we want to go beyond the buzzword. We want to do more than talk about cyber stuff that are not concrete. We really want to talk today about the risks that are specific to the mining industry. What does that mean? And the objective of that is that you have the tools that you need to go back either to your board, if you're a board member, to go back to your executive and start talking about specific risk. It's like you're having 4 different experts that get to give you an hour of free time today with what they see is a risk for you and what you should likely do for it. So today we're going to talk about cybersecurity, but we're going to talk about it in a way that is pragmatic, holistic, and that if not gives you specific solution, gives you very specific areas in which you can look for these solutions. If you have any question at any time, feel free to you can use the Q&A function. We'll be looking at that too. If we don't have time to respond to all of the questions, we'll try our best to follow up after. We know some of the questions sometimes we don't necessarily want to talk about it publicly, and that's fine too. It's, cybersecurity and risk management is something that's very personal to every every industry and also every company. There's no right way of doing it. Otherwise, a presentation would probably be, here are the top 10 things you need to do. And at the end of the year, you will not have a data breach. But the truth is, that's quite unlikely. So the first thing is that it's a critical infrastructure to begin with. There is currently a political situation going on around this. But even before that, and that's nothing new. And that's why sometimes I hear people talk about the situation like it's new. I remember reading about this 15 years ago. This is something that has been known. This is something that, there has been attack on critical infrastructure before I didn't even finish my law degree. So this is not a new phenomenon, but few people know that the energy and utility are in the top 10 industry the most attacked. So we always talk about personal information. We talk about, and in Canada is funny because we are very famous for a very particular type of consumer goods data breach. But the truth is, these type of cyber attack on OT infrastructure and critical infrastructure do happen in Canada as well. Without naming names, just in the last few weeks, a few came forward. But before that, it did happen as well. The reason for that, and by the way, if you look online, and these are public numbers, Idaho, Quebec gets up to 800 cyber attack a month. So it's not something that comes out of the blues. It's not something that we decided to talk about today because of what's going on in the world. But there's a few things about the mining industry that makes it either difficult to manage from a cybersecurity perspective. And that's not to say that cybersecurity is ever easy to manage for everybody. But first of all, the sites are often remote. So that means there can be challenges to using classical cybersecurity tools. There can be challenges to converge your IT system with your OT system. And now we think about something even more common. There can be hurricanes, earthquake, volcano, no electricity. All of these things happen all the time in remote site. There can be, a bad day, bad weather. So there's always a business continuity issue. There's always a health and safety issue to deal with. Some company can operate in the comfort of thinking that a cybersecurity attack is their only concern when it comes to their IT system. But when it comes to mining, there were concerns before cybersecurity. And the issue we have is that this is not accumulating in a big problem where we need interdisciplinary I think we need interdisciplinary knowledge to look at it and to understand how we can tackle that. And maybe in that industry, more than any other industry, what we really need is more convergence. We cannot have our IT department not talking to the other one while we have people that are in remote site in which we may not be able to respond to an incident on site. So it's the coordination of all these risks become very important. And we feel like it has also put a lot of pressure on directors and officers to take the right decisions. And sometimes with budgets that are not what they wish they were also. And the thing is, it's a critical infrastructure, which means that there are people depending on you. It's fine if you don't have electricity for an hour, but what if we don't have electricity for 6 months? That means our entire economy is down. What if we don't have the internet? What if we don't have access to gas? It doesn't take a lot, and we take a lot for granted. And that's a big issue with critical infrastructure, mining, energies, and the likes, is that the effects tend to go very, very, very far to people who basically on a day-to-day basis don't think about this industry. It's not something that comes to their mind. So it's easy to talk about cell phone security and maybe you'll get them to post a password. But when we're talking about critical infrastructure security, it's a little bit more complex, because if you want to think as a malicious actor, you have a lot of things you can do. You can start and bother the consumer with their iPhone. You can start and bother the iPhone company. Or you can also bother the company that's making the material for the iPhone. And now you're going to bother everybody. So that's the thing with critical infrastructure, is that for a long time, they were perceived as non-interesting because they did not have a lot of information. But as the climate changed, there are different things that can affect how they're interested. That means they have a different threat modeling system. And for that reason, the model that we took today is that we're going to tackle 5 big areas of risk. We can obviously go on and find like 30 of them, but we use areas that are large enough so that we can hear the perspective of our panelists about what are the risks in that area? What would I do? How can you help it? Is this something you should be worried about? And does it relate to cybersecurity? Sometimes cybersecurity can make things better, sometimes worse. It's a little bit like technology, right? It'd be great if we had all intelligent mining everywhere. It'd be great if we have drones that would deliver lunch to all of our workers, and then we wouldn't even need to talk to them, right? So there's so much we can do in the sites. But is that good? Is that helping the situation, or is that making it worse? So we'll see that there's 5 different perspectives that we took today. And I'm going to call on each of the panelists to give us their feedback, and obviously I may comment on a few of them from a legal perspective, but I think as a general comment, what you need to know is that the worst legal defense is to do nothing right now. This is not an unknown risk. So if you're listening to this and you say, okay, and you do nothing, that is a legal risk in itself. Now, which decision you take, as long as it's reasonable, that's something that we can work with. So the idea today is to understand that there's not one decision, there's not one way to do things, but there's only one option, which is to try to understand and try to take action. So these are not necessarily recommendations that I make for you, for your business, but these are general principles that you should be able to think when you think about risk related to cybersecurity. So my first topic today is health and safety. Why? Because it doesn't say cyber. So it's something that surprises people. We're not going to talk about robots first. We're not going to talk about drones. Health and safety. What does that have to do with cybersecurity? Why is that important? And why would I care? Let's say I'm a chief information security officer, or I'm in charge of security for a mining company. What does health and safety has to do with me? And I'm going to start with Jerome.
Thank you, Vanessa. Appreciate that. Health and safety is an interesting topic, because oftentimes when we sit down with a lot of our partners out there in the critical infrastructure space, I often say that safety equals cybersecurity. And the reason I say that is because, number one, humans are one of the weakest links when it comes to any type of program. By nature, we're trusting. And so oftentimes we have to increase the awareness in the organization. The culture of the security awareness in the organization needs to be ongoing. It means that not only those who are particularly participating in managing the assets themselves, the engineers, the executives, those who are in IT and OT, but every person within the organization, all the way down to the administrative assistant, and the security forces should be involved in the idea of understanding security and increasing that awareness, so that there is no particular, as we say, offense that is being put around. You don't have any particular gaping hole, because no one in the organization should say it's not my responsibility. That's number one. Number two, I think it increases also what we call the emotional and psychological awareness within an organization. Because the more you have employees that are equipped and have knowledges and understand the processes within the organization, the more confident they feel. And also it becomes not just another part or another something that they're adding, but it's integrated into their overall work process. So a field engineer who's out there, who's putting together these systems, he or she understands exactly what it needs to be making their systems, and comparing them and putting and engaging the suppliers and those who they're working with to answer some of the questions, so they can ensure that the program and the awareness is continually going through all parts of those who are involved in the process.
Yeah, and that's a first perspective, right? You have the awareness and training part of it, which sometimes surprises people, but it needs to be part of working safely. When you go to a restaurant, you're a restaurant worker, you wash your hand. You don't ask why, right? Getting employees to go there should be considered health and safety, especially in this type of situation where, a mistake can be costly. The other thing is, you see on that image, these are people that have integrated other type of security. I would never work with all of this, all over my face and a lot of things. But then on one end, we're trying to say, yeah, but it's a lot to ask for them for password, right? So I think it's a question of culture. When we have a culture, we have a way of doing things, and people believe that it's for the benefit of the good, then people are doing it. So if your employees are not doing training and awareness, it's because they likely don't understand that it's also health and safety. And I think that's a good way to put it. Andy, I'd like to hear you also, and I'd like to hear a perspective around why is that industry, in particular health and safety, why is that important for that industry? Is there more risk to employees? Is it that it's more difficult to do it for them? Or maybe because they're all in remote sites, so that mustn't be easy. So I'm interested into getting another feedback as well.
Okay, hey, thanks, Vanessa, and nice to be in touch with everybody tuned in. my world, the Idaho National Lab, we primarily focus when we're not working on nuclear energy research and development. We're focusing on operational technology or industrial control systems, cybersecurity. The thing is, with these types of systems, they are now increasingly interconnected with each other. Almost every sector is using the term modernizing, which means going from, which I'm speaking generally, but generally means going from processes that were more manual or analog in the past, and now more based on software running in computers that are networked to each other. And we do all that because it makes us faster, makes us more efficient, allows us some capabilities that we didn't have before. But there is a price to pay for that. In the past, safety systems in industrial plant, in industrial contexts, used to be separate from the other IT and OT control systems in operational technology. But again, because we love convenience and we're always trying to be more efficient, we have now networked everything together. And we've made it possible for a potential attacker to come in through IT, which is the usually most easy way to come in, to navigate into the operational technology side if there's not proper segmentation and detection. And I'm not going to go too deep on these things. And then potentially reach the safety systems that are back to health and safety. Those things are what lie between a potentially damaging or catastrophic accident in the physical plant and the employees who work around those systems, who manage those systems. So there was an example, if you want to look it up. It was called, I may need help pulling this up. I was thinking the other day, Trisis and Triconics for the names of the systems in the Middle East. I'm not going to name the location that were breached. These are safety systems. And the adversary came a hair's breadth away from creating destruction and either killing or at least hurting a bunch of people. So that's sort of a proof of concept. We wondered if that was possible. And a few years ago, it was demonstrated. And so now we are, I guess, doubling our attention on those systems to make sure that safety systems are fully separate from other control systems. And guess what? They're not. So something to be aware of depending on the environment that you either work in or that you manage on behalf of your colleagues and partners. Okay, how's that, Vanessa?
Yeah, and I do remember, I unfortunately forgot the name, but it was tested in the United States on a generator, whether or not it could explode, and the answer is yes. And it took something like less than an hour or so using a specific remote access, right?
Yeah, that's, if you don't mind, that's relatively close to home, and I can do it in 15 seconds.
Go for it.
In 2008, this is the test called the Aurora.
Yes.
Test. It was conducted at my lab in Idaho before I got there. And yes, it was the first time, I'm sure there may be more secret things, but first time someone typed on a keyboard some distance away and made a medium-sized diesel generator kill itself. And all kinds of VIPs and dignitaries were there to watch this from a safe distance. And they saw it happen, and it sent shivers through everybody who previously thought, yeah, this is just something that eggheads and nerds say is possible. It could never happen. It happened. And ever since then, we've been paying more attention to this on the defensive side. So there you go.
And Ron, from your standpoint, do you see that this is something that's been, is this something that was always there? Is this something that we maybe did not notice? Or is this something that is becoming more and more prevalent, and then we see the risk going up? And is that something that organization, you think, is that a risk that should be considered with more attention when we come about modernizing, like we like to say it, or to make things intelligent, or to automate? That as I remember it, and that this is not yesterday. It's been some time, right?
I think, and in line probably with what Andy would say, is that there's been people that have thought about this. Actually, fun fact, Canada's almost the birthplace of this type of thinking for a very weird reason. And one of the individuals that participated in our event was a Canadian at the time too. But there's been this forethought about this. Even circa 9/11, there was actually discussions from Congress talking about health and safety, or from the securing of critical infrastructure. Maybe not for the pretense of destroying things, but from the pretense of protecting those systems and keeping them operating, because they're such a fundamental piece of almost every country's economics these days. So there always was a thought about it. There was maybe less of a consideration towards developing secure products and properly engineering these systems. And to be really honest, convergence has already occurred. There was a gentleman, I think named Tyler Williams, who said, there's no O or I in T, there's just T in technology. Now, when we get closer to cyber physical systems, the barrier changes a bit. But convergence happened and started in the 80s. It went full tilt in the 90s and early 2000s. We already had it. And there's almost nowhere you can see that in mining today where that convergence has not already occurred and will continue to occur. So we're just seeing those risks multiplying. And we're also seeing those risks multiply because of the commoditization and ubiquitous nature of information these days that's being shared, open platforms, less of a proprietary nature. And so all of that is bubbling up into, and also the ease and use of open source and reuse, which was another goal we accomplished. But all of that is bubbling up into us seeing its effects materialize in industries like mining, and those impacts or those threats could very well affect health, safety, and even the environmental piece, the HS&E.
And what's interesting is that you see that convergent on the legal side as well. So sometimes people will say, well, we don't have cybersecurity laws. No, but we have a Charter of Rights and Freedom. We have a criminal code. I mean, unauthorized access to information is still unauthorized access to information. We have health and safety laws. We have a number of things, and we even have an extra contractual way to sue people if they're being negligent. So when we say that we have no cybersecurity law, maybe we have no law with the name cybersecurity. That's a very different thing. And I'm waiting to see what's going to happen on the health and safety side, and will there be a convergence between these labor laws and these obligation towards employees, and that obligation of maintaining safe sites in which they can work and they can thrive as well. So it'll be interesting to understand where that goes. And the reason why we're asking this is that even though they're critical infrastructure, most of them are private infrastructure, which means that even though the government would, let's say, decide that there would be a fifth domain of war that would be cyber war, the IT and OT systems of private companies are still inaccessible without warrants or without legal recourses. So defending these critical infrastructure becomes difficult because you can't just deploy the military because these are not yours. So you end up in a situation where you have a board that has a lot of responsibilities and probably doesn't have enough help for the size of the threat. And the first victim of that situation tend to be the individuals who are working at remote site and who often don't have access to easy evacuation methods either. So health and safety is our first risk in relation to cybersecurity. So it's not a robot that we're concerned about, number one. We're concerned about individuals as our first risk. So now let's go to our second risk, where we're going to be talking about automation and emerging tech. So we already talked a little bit about it, but in terms of what can it do, to individuals down the line. But beyond individuals, I mean, and you can see on that pictures, everything is not connected, and everything can have IoTs and can pick up data, and then you can decide if this data leads to something. And there can be a lot of advantage into doing that, obviously. If a piece of equipment is about to break and could actually maybe kill somebody, then you're happy to know that. There's obviously not only bad things with that. But there's one thing that lawyers have noticed is that it just falls in the crack of the big discussion that we're having around personal information, because none of this is personal. Most of this it's commercial information. And who's responsible to protect that? Well, there's no law. There's nobody that tells you that you have to protect your thing. And that would be silly because there's nobody telling you have to protect your TV from being stolen, except maybe your insurance that's going to start pushing if you leave the door open. And that's what's happening here. The only legal principle that the I would say the main legal principle is that directors and officers have to take reasonable decisions to protect the corporate, the corporate information, the corporate assets, and the likes. So how do I take a good decision with all of this going on? Half of it I don't know. With contracts, I don't know. And from a lawyer perspective, we live in the matrix. All I see is contracts and contracts and contracts. And I hope you don't see that, because it's very disturbing. But I'd like to have your point of view on what are the risks with automating all of this, using all of these emerging tech. And we know there are opportunities. The question is, which risk do I need to take into consideration when I'm considering an opportunity? Is it a compatibility risk? And what does that mean for a board of director? Ron, I'd like to start with you.
Okay. So I'm a very pragmatic individual. I should have a lot more white hairs on my head because of that, I think, in a very different era and time. But cybersecurity is either the result of proper engineering, or poor cybersecurity is the lack of proper engineering. When we're thinking about automation and emerging technology, I like to think about things a bit differently versus, let's go buy the latest thing, which is going to get us data, which is going to somehow magically equate into revenue. That's not how these type of things work. You need to consider total cost of ownership. You need to think about the other substantial infrastructure improvements that underpin your operational activity. And security shouldn't be considered as a cost sink just for the purpose of executing, or this infrastructure shouldn't be seen as a singular function type of investment. They're much more than that. This is how you do business today, and you will foreseeably doing business for this decade and the next. And so if you're going to move towards newer technologies, or you're going to start integrating things in, you need to always consider that you're probably going to have to go back and retrofit much of your past investments, and you might wind up actually in the same place in terms of data and getting results, but you're going to have to circle back on those things a little bit differently. So I think of automation, emergent technology a bit different than other people. And as we try to be competitive globally, whether that's in Canada, the United States, Latin America, across the world, and we saw this in oil and gas with changing prices of oil a barrel, automation got pushed, and then there was no maintenance on it. And so you actually unconsciously accepted those risks. There's many, many different pieces that are kind of moving here as we integrate into these things, but we're not accounting for the cyber. We're not accounting for the maintenance of these assets. We're not accounting about changing of supply chains, right? So, for example, you say, previously to COVID, I could go call up Cisco and get a just-in-time manufactured device and replace that one was broken under an SLA of 24 hours. That's not true today. Cisco unlikely can't even give you an estimate on a product for a spare shortly. So there's many different pieces that are kind of all pulling together, and I think it's very important to be thinking about automation, emerging technology from a more pragmatic standpoint, and also, before moving to new things, managing what you currently already have.
And Andy, you touched base a little bit on this before in terms of automation. And when you see that from an ecosystem perspective and from the perspective of growing, and there's obviously the mining industry, and it speaks to another industry and another industry. How do you see that in terms of using emerging technologies and the likes? Are we there yet? And what kind of precautions? Like Ron mentioned, it's happening. It's not a question of should you do it or not. You're doing it. So what are the risks that you need to wait in, so to make sure that your final project is something that makes sense for the entire ecosystem?
Okay. I'd say your risks are all caught up in complexity. Systems that we don't fully understand being connected with other systems that we don't fully understand. Software having both vulnerabilities that could be exploited by adversaries and bugs that can just cause trouble that haven't been detected yet with no malicious intent required. A second type of risk in this world that we're discussing on this question is dependencies and interdependencies. All of these systems work fine provided there's enough electricity and that the temperatures are about right, and that we have adequate water to cool things that need to be cooled, or to generate steam, for example, and that transportation and communications are working. If you don't think about all those things, but you only focus on the complex system in question, you could be blindsided, and all your work is for naught, or at least you have significant disruptions that cost the business lots of productivity, potentially lots of money. The last thing is going back to where I started on the previous question, dependency on these systems, and what if you were to lose access to them, or you needed to turn them off for a little while because you had concerns, unscheduled downtime. Are you able to work in a more manual mode? And that's the domain of resilience. Can you keep things going, maybe at a degraded state, but nevertheless moving forward operationally until you're able to stand your systems back up again with confidence? And again, sometimes we're thinking about malicious activities. Sometimes we're just thinking about these things coming down because of under the sheer weight of the complexity they carry. So there you go.
And I think that's a good point. And it speaks to the complexity of business continuity, right? It's a whole different thing of doing business continuity for a small little firm of 10 person and trying to do business continuity in this industry. It takes time, it takes practice, it takes a lot of expertise. And it's sometimes, if not often, we don't know what a crisis is. So we are in a crisis, unfortunately.
For sure.
And I think growing the ecosystem with a pillar that is obviously shaky will not help the entire ecosystem. So I think that's an important point. Always get your house into order before you buy your neighbor's house, right? And I think that's a good start for building an ecosystem that works. And Jerome, let's say I wanted to work. What do I do? What are your, let's say, top 3 advice on making sure I can build an intelligent ecosystem on the long run, something that will have some perennity?
Yeah, sure. I think when we sit down oftentimes with stakeholders to answer your question, the first question is what problem are you trying to solve? Too often in organizations, you see them have all these tools and they think the tool itself is going to solve the problem, when they really don't have a true understanding of the core or the root issues and where they're trying to bring those integrations. I think that is really number one. I think number 2 is really sitting down and understanding, once you know what problem you're solving, exactly what process you're going to put in place to ensure that you're creating efficiencies. Because to add something else, to add another technology to solve your problem can only exacerbate the problem. Because you have just another set of tools. It's not highly integratable. And then it makes the problem solving even more complex. As to Andy's point, when you really start an integration of emerging technologies into existing technologies, number one, that of itself is an issue, is a challenge. And I really believe that security at this point should be security by design. We should no longer be designing any type of critical infrastructure without security being in the actual engineering and construction process. Because what we always know that the problem we've seen before is when we try to come behind and solve the problem and try to retrofit, that in of itself can become an issue. And I think the third item in terms of how do we create an ecosystem is really sitting down and planning out and really mapping out what is the strategic direction we want to take this technology and where we can create the efficiencies. Because number one, in order for us to get to an operation resiliency, you've got to have several items within the organization, including process integrity, needs to be put in place as well to ensure that you actually have true success.
And I think what I'm hearing there is it comes back to maybe what may seem obvious, but it's still not being applied. But there's a circle when you create a project, right? You need to plan your project. Then you need to execute your project. And then you need to improve your project as well. So the first lesson is also not to be overly ambitious. Sometimes it's better to have a small working project and then you can grow from that project and from your learning. So there's different ways you can work in agile manners to implement what you want to implement with making sure you have a fallback as you go. So sometimes you need to take your project into pieces and then you need to develop, test, and make sure that it works. The other thing that I see from a legal perspective is you need to understand your risk. If you come to me and you ask me for a contract, I need to know what is your RTO, what is your RPO, what is your resistance to this being down, and that speaks to what Andy has mentioned. And once you have your circle done, you obviously want to make sure everything has been prevented. But unfortunately, it doesn't always goes that way. Then comes the security incident, then comes the business continuity, and then comes the lawyers, unfortunately. And then we're gonna look at the contract, and was the contract tailored to your needs, your technology? Not all contracts are born equal. Not all contracts are tailored to a situation. And it's really important, if you're building something that you want to have a certain perennity over several years, you want to make sure that the contracts are going to evolve with you, are going to allow you to reach your objective, but are also going to allow you to hold the other party accountable. The reason for that is that there's no law holding them accountable. You write your own law, so why would you write a bad law to start with? So I think there's a lot to think about, but if it's well done, if you're able to write a good contract, that means you've been able to plan it out and you've been able to go through different stage in projects. So I think project management should definitely not be underestimated either. And that brings us to our third risk, which is specifically the IT-OT convergence. And I know that this may seem repetitive to some people in the industry, but for others, and includes lawyers, it's something that we just start to hear about. And it's not clear, how is that related? What do you mean this can cause this or this can cause that? That's number one. And number two, okay, but what do I do now? Now that we know that it's there, what's the next thing? How do I make sure that I control my risk that way? Does it require a different way to manage suppliers? Does it require a different way to manage my security? Do I need to have the same type of talents? How does that work? So I'm going to start with Andy. It's always a surprise, so I keep you on your edge.
Okay, I'm here. Vanessa, would you mind teeing up my question again?
Yeah, of course. So mostly the third areas of risk we're looking at is IT-OT convergence. And we're looking at risks that are coming out from it, but we're also looking at making sure that everybody's on the same page on what these risks are and what does it mean to converge this, because it's one of these IT buzzwords for a lot of experts. And for those who are not experts, it's a brand new subject that means a lot of things and everything and nothing. So we want to spend a few minutes better understanding what that means in terms of risk, in terms of structure, governance. What does it mean concretely, except being very cool hashtag on LinkedIn?
Okay, sure. I think again, in a previous response, I was referring to a time when things that, let's say in the energy sector, that made, moved, or managed electricity. And I imagine there are, because that's my primary domain, but I imagine there are many parallels in mining where the actual job of mining, excavation, and getting a hold of materials and then transporting them where they needed to go, that this was largely a mechanical process controlled by humans, operated by human operators. And back to the same thing, right? Because in order to be competitive against competition, you have to automate things and remove people with salaries from the process. We're just driven to do that. Also, if we remove people from certain dangerous jobs, we're also keeping them safe, right? So there we have IT has been the business, and OT, now that it's technology, is the actual execution of the physical things that have to happen, the kinetic things that have to happen in manufacturing, in mining, in energy production, in water filtration, et cetera. They used to be more separate. That was less convenient, less efficient, but in a sense, more secure from a cybersecurity point of view, because it was hard to get to anything that could matter coming through the IT systems. It's helpful for executives, for them to be able to see what's going on in the OT world. In order for them to do that, many of them want dashboards. They want something they can look at on their screen that shows them how productive or not productive the folks doing the actual operations are, so that they can do tweaks and tuning operations and yell at people if they need to in management to try to improve things. So yeah, I think it's like one of those statements made earlier. They are already converged and are converging. And this other acronym that's made out of these letters, IIoT and IIoT, the Internet of Things and the Industrial Internet of Things, that's just adding more sensors that are connected and networked and that ultimately reach operations and IT people. It's just, we're going in deeper and deeper. I think you mentioned the Matrix earlier, Vanessa. It's getting to be more and more like the Matrix, as every single device, everything that we care about is potentially reachable by an IP address. There's an IP address and reachable. I would just want people to be cognizant of what they're doing as they're adding these things to, in a ubiquitous way. They are taking on more risk, and to do so very carefully.
So, and I think that's a very fair warning, and unfortunately has proven true in the last few weeks in several sites and several locations. Now, Ron, I'm turning back to you. So, okay, so what do I do now? Now that it's done, what do I do? What's next?
Sorry about that, Ron.
Can I just air gap everything and then it will magically be safe? Does that work?
No, it doesn't.
Oh.
It doesn't. I wish that were the case, but I think Iran learned that lesson with the Stuxnet attack. And Andy, ring that bell for me, because everyone, we hate using this as the example. But the truth of everything is, and we see this in the industry as well, air gaps just don't work. We outsource. What does outsourcing mean to you? Well, people are bringing laptops into your environment and bypassing that little, that gate at the front of the facility. They're getting entrance into the facilities, and guess what? If I don't have connectivity, how do I get my updates into the facility? Well, guess what? A USB stick comes out. So air gaps are just not a good answer. They actually prevent you from maintaining these assets in a way that would probably be sufficient for lawyers in a courtroom. And again, it's out of my courthouse, literally. But it's something to be cognizant of. An air gap is effectively putting your car on blocks in the garage and never driving it, except in this case, you are driving it and you're not doing any of the preventative maintenance on the consumable pieces of it. So air gaps are not a solution, and neither are data diodes, unless they're used in very specific applications. So convergence is already there, as Andy said, and it's really about starting to plan for what your bad days are going to look like. And I know Andy's going to have a great segue on that, and I'm pretty sure Jerome will too. But technology has had a demonstrable effect on the way that we run businesses. So, circling back, what drives? There's certain things for dashboards, but we've also forgotten the environmental compliance pieces. If you're not able to provide consistent data to the government officials about how you're managing your effluent and what are the particulate matters being produced for CO2 and all of these things. I mean, mining is, in essence, in quintessence, is a series of different domains. You have management of water and treatment in most mining facilities. You have energy production, right? You're generating steam to run these big facilities. You have any number of things, air filtration, HVAC, building concerns. Then you have all the manufacturing pieces that we'd see, like conveyor belts, palletizers potentially. There's automated trucks, for example, which are basically starting to happen. So there's all of these different pieces that are all winding up there, and they're being glued and paper mache'd together, whether we like it or not, and data is going to continue driving the business until that bad day happens. And you're on mute, Vanessa.
Obviously. So this obviously brings a nice segue into our next area of risk, which quite frankly, I feel has been the talk of the year on my end. It has always been, how do I manage a supplier then moving forward? Because first they seem to know what they're doing. That's number one. And I don't really know it. I'm in mining. I'm not necessarily into all of these type of technologies. They're asking for several access. They're asking often for several updates, maybe that changes the system. And that makes a lot of people to manage in case there's a breach as well. So I want to talk to you, Jerome, as first. I'd like to know what are some of the main good practice that actually works, because I've seen everything from outsourcing everything to a country that they don't know nothing based on just an AI. I've seen everything from having 200 employees to try to automate it. how do we move forward? Because it has happened. There's IT, there's OT, there's a mix of people. What do I know? What do I do next? And what are your recommendations?
Yeah, sure. So I think when we start talking about supplier management, it falls under what we call a risk management program, and within the supply chain itself, there's many phases of or parts of it, of which at any one of those part process you can get compromised on. I think it's important to really understand the suppliers you have within your organization. You should be able to understand the risks that they are presenting to your organization. So you should really sit down and really understand what it is that they're supplying. Number one, we find a lot of challenges out there with with our partners is we find that they often don't know who the suppliers are, because when you go all the way downstream, they're getting one supplier to the other. A case in point is where you may have an RTU coming in and they have a chipset that's in there, but that chipset is coming from one manufacturer where it's being considered where it was listed in a nation state attack previously. So the question then for them is, where does that chipset relies in the whole organization? And so that brings in the whole idea and the concept of asset management, really trying to manage that portfolio and ensuring that number one, you're understanding who your suppliers are, and number two, you have the controls and you're pushing down exactly the integrity of the processes that they should be following, because there may be suppliers that may be considered to be more of a higher risk, and so you need to understand and vet that out as part of that process so that you can make sure that they're communicating. Because too often when we go out there, you have all of these sites, particularly when you look at the renewables, when you go into commissioning, you have a lot of third parties coming in. They're accessing the systems to help commission, maintain the systems. And then once the system becomes substantially complete and then it's going into fully commissioned, you still have all of these connective parts in there, but nobody knows how they got there, why they're there. And that also becomes another issue too. So really managing your suppliers, understanding the risk, and then putting controls in for each of those suppliers, and make sure that is actually in one central place. Too often, when you start having multiple business units in an organization trying to manage this portfolio, it can be very, that in itself increases the risk. So you truly need to understand when it comes to supplier management.
That's something I noticed. Sometimes it's more of a mess than it is of an issue. As I said, I think we should start the Marie Kondo of cybersecurity, and it's often just understanding what data you have, what supplier you have, what system you have. Just that will be half of the work, and will take a lot of time and will be manually intensive. And that's why I want to take a break here, because I don't want to scare everybody. I don't want anybody to think they're gonna have to do exactly like the picture, go on site and say, why is this not working? Show me. Because that obviously would be very demanding resource-wise. So Ron, what are some ways that I can do supplier management without opening a brand new office doing it full time?
Yes. Well, to be really fair, supplier management is really an extension of your third-party risk. It really truly is, and procurement will even follow under that third-party risk kind of portfolio. So most large organizations already have a vehicle for describing those roles and functionalities, just a bit of an extension and maybe an educational journey. I would argue that site assessments are very useful in some regards, not to point fingers at people, but to get an idea of where, maybe if you did a sample, where certain suppliers and incumbent vendors that are managing certain pieces are maybe not hiding things from you, but again, we are subject to the negatives of a capitalistic society. Vendors have to make money at a certain point, and certain projects and organizations are ran differently, even though they have a certain banner above them. The same is true for sites. Some are self-managed, some are the product of a divestation and an M&A activity. There's many different pieces here. So I don't think you necessarily need to set up a whole new office, but there's technologies out there to help you assess your current sites and their risk portfolios, that you could sample the types of assets on them and get an idea of their security profiles. And then you could associate those to the larger programs that Jerome was mentioning, right? The larger capabilities. And you could start to get a feel out and build out budgets, build out initiatives, and measurable concrete work packages to get things down to a level that you're comfortable with, or at least your shareholders will be appeased by you demonstrating that you have attention to detail, but also a focus on resiliency and integrity. So I think there's a bunch of pieces you can do, and you could start with a small selection and just go from there. Always trust but validate.
And Andy, except from trying to make a generator explode, is there some type of POC I should be doing? Is there some type of success criteria that can reassure me that my 3 months open at the beginning of my contract was enough, and now I can move forward with the process?
I'm glad you used the word reassured. In me, that triggered a phrase from the former CEO of Intel, Andy Grove, who used to say, and titled a book, Only the Paranoid Survive, which means never fully trust anything. Don't be too reassured by anything. Always be seeking more information so that your risk is at least better understood by you. How much you can do about it is another question, but seek to always be curious and learn more about your risk, including from suppliers. I think without going more technical, I'm going to go less technical. Talk to them, let them know you're interested, establish some better relationship, and see if you can have a discussion about their own approach to cybersecurity and how the two companies, yours and theirs, are coordinating in the places where you potentially touch. That's it. Basic, human, talk with each other, maybe meet with each other and see what both sides are willing to share so that they might be more confident that they're both doing their job.
Right. And I think that's something that is not said enough. I've negotiated 2 companies that have never spoken together, and then you realize the other lawyer thinks something is happening, you think something is happening, but then the manager wants something else. That doesn't start the relationship necessarily good. It's important you're on the same page with your supplier. You both understand what the success criteria are. It's important that you know what's the objective in a year, 2 years, 3 years. Do you want them to maintain? Do you want them to remain compatible? What do you want? And quite frankly, if you want to make our job easier as lawyer, it'd be great if you know as well, because otherwise I'm going to send you a template that is not going to fit your actual needs and your actual ecosystem. And I'm going to end this areas of risk, which probably the most sensitive one. And I'm obviously not looking for confidential information here, but we want to talk a little bit about one thing that is less likely to happen in a bakery shop than it is in a critical infrastructure. So we want to talk a little bit about risk of cyber espionage, adverse persistent threats. What does that mean really? And can I do anything about it? And except call my insurance. So we know we need an incident response plan. We know we need a security operations center. But what does that mean for mining industry with remote sites all over the world? And that is mostly and it's a challenging question, obviously. I've done part of my studies on cyber espionage, so I couldn't help myself. So I'll start with you, Ron. What are your thoughts on advanced persistent threats, cyber espionage, and the risk in that particular industry?
Sure. So without the sensitive pieces, I think actually the biggest threat to most mining organizations is their infrastructure. What that means is in almost every facility I've ever been in, and this is true except for maybe in some of the more greenfield facilities, we're looking at hardware that's a decade old or older. We're looking at flaky fiber runs. We're looking at lack of resources on site. We're looking at situations that multiply the impacts of something occurring. So regardless of a malicious party going after your organization, you're probably you're the biggest risk to yourself. I've seen cases where union disputes wind up with direct insider malicious events, right? They're not meant to be cyber, but someone decides, that looks like a fiber run or a conduit. I'm just going to run into a forklift and pretend it's an accident, right? I've seen that happen. I know what happens. And those are really frequent events in organizations that are on average between 16 and 20% of the events you'll have. But when it comes to APTs, and this is a great segue for Andy later, I draw inspiration to focusing on what these groups might do. Yes, we can focus on espionage, and yes, we can focus on certain informational threats or destruction. But the reality of this stuff is that you can draw inspiration from nature. Wildfires give us a worst cost estimate of what something's going to cost. So in Kelowna, we saw the pipe, or not, it was in Kelowna, but in Fort McMurray, we saw pipelines getting emergency buttoned, so halted. Well, what did that do? That established what the outer cost would be if someone had to press the big red button during a cyber incident. So now we know what worst case is going to cost. We know that connectivity in remote regions is scarce, and we can argue again that Elon Musk's latest and greatest technology might offer better communication and more reliable on the ISPs of the world, but still, that's a fundamental piece there. So your threat is actually, or your vehicle in there is you're reliant on these certain technologies. But the reason why I keep mentioning about weather is that that's actually the best place to make your worst days occur. And this is if you were really an APT that wasn't focused just on the data pieces of it, but focusing on economics and actually causing massive pieces or massive effects against your organization, I would be focused on things like I did in the ICS detection challenge a few years ago at a different conference. I had the data set for a very, very, very large mine that's anonymous. And my ultimate goal was to attack the power generation for this facility. And I made it as a joke. It was in northern Quebec. It's going to be far below zero during the winters. But guess what? You need energy to keep water warm. You need energy to keep your barracks and your employees warm. So anything along those lines could introduce things like your sluices being frozen. You could wind up with your employees having to be evacuated. You could wind up with all sorts of things that you don't want occurring, and that could be done either from someone going after generators, certainly a forest fire wrecking the powerhouse. It could be anything, but those are the situations you would look forward to. The other thing in terms of APTs, we will see them going after things like economic impacts. Well, your organization might be, especially in Canada where we're resource driven, I would target industries such as mining because they're generally they're high volume but low margin industries. They're often competing against global markets, and so there isn't much room to wiggle. So if I were an APT, I would go after your facility's contingency budgets. Why would I do that? Well, we can draw inspiration again from the oil price crash from several years ago. We could say the price of ore would crash, whatever, but I'll use oil as an example. So at that time in Alberta, previously they'd been used to, $100 a barrel, and now it dropped down to 35, which is barely, under NAFTA, is barely even profitable, right? And so the same would be for ore transfer in the United States and aluminum and things like that. But let's say, for example, your profit margins from the corporate level are nearing the limit where you shut down the plant or you will divest that set of assets, that facility. Well, let's say because you haven't been doing all of these cyber hygiene and engineering practices and you haven't been managing them, and someone keeps going after your facility and causing these little shutdowns. You're burning $100,000 an hour. Well, let's say you had a contingency budget for 10 hours, $1 million. You go through that in the first quarter of the year and the price of ore isn't looking great. So you have your general manager or whoever has to go up to the board and ask for more money to be released to make sure things keep going, or the shareholders are asking for understanding. Well, chances are the board's not going to give you the money to continue operating your plant. And guess what? As an attacker, I didn't have to destroy anything. I just needed to be such an inconvenience to you that low barrier but high frequency events actually resulted in a high impact event. And so that's why I think APTs, they might be targeted for certain reasons, but they might not actually work in the ways that you think. You should actually focus on what your worst days would be. And so again, you might not be directly attacked by an APT. That's much more rare than people think, but you might be the result of racketeering by your local cartel in Mexico, for example, right? There's very different. Each region will have different kind of threats. But my goal, when I think of an advanced threat, I think about my worst days and I engineer my way backwards from that. And again, that's a great segue for Andy because he wrote the book on consequence-based engineering.
I was going to say exactly that. Andy, this is your last chance to scare us, because then after that, Jerome and I are going to try to show some things that can be done. But I'd like to know more about, we know it's possible. How possible, how often, and what's happening exactly out there. I know it may seem obvious to some people, it may seem less obvious to others, and what's our actual capacity? Of course, Canada went through it, but I think worldwide, what's our actual capacity to address the advanced persistent threats that we have in our critical infrastructure or mining at the moment? Or whatever you think is scary, go for it.
First of all, I've always said that I'm not trying to be scary. I'm not trying to alarm people. There are some colleagues of ours, of Ron and Jerome's and me, we are all cyber defenders of infrastructure. There are particular colleagues I'm thinking of and won't name who scare everyone to death. And then they leave the room, they leave the talk, and they just leave people curled up in a fetal position. I always say there's too much important work to do. It's very difficult to do when you're in the fetal position. So I never want to be like that, but I'll still try to address the question. My colleagues at the Idaho National Lab, which again is one of the centers of the universe for industrial control systems, cybersecurity, they have a mantra, and it goes like this. If you're critical infrastructure, you will be targeted. And if you're targeted, you will be compromised. So you don't get to choose whether you are or you aren't critical infrastructure. And no matter how good your cyber hygiene is, assuming you are giving it a good try, certain adversaries will get in and you won't know it. They'll be on your networks and in your systems. There are things you can do. One of them is called, we created a methodology for. It has a lot of hyphens and words, and I'll reduce it. It's consequence-driven, cyber-informed engineering. And so that's CCE. And the phrase says what it is. It's about prioritizing what you do in cybersecurity entirely by identifying the worst things that could happen to you, your company, your people, your customers, and making sure that that's where you put the majority of your focus. Everybody tries to protect everything. That's good. That's called cyber hygiene. And we do the best practices and we try to conform to standards, all the things that everybody does. But CCE, that methodology, which is described in a book called Countering Cyber Sabotage, CCE hopes to take the very most important things, the most important targets an APT or attacker would go after, and we say take them off the table, make them impossible or nearly so for the attacker to create the very worst effects. We do that by engineering primarily, going back to the analog tools and technologies, fail-safes and stopgaps, and sometimes inserting a trusted human back in the loop who you removed for efficiency and cost savings. But if you only had that man or woman's eyeballs on the process, they saw something going sideways, they might be able to intercede in time to save the day, or at least limit the amount of damage. A couple other things, and then boom. Make sure that before the bad thing happens, if it were to happen, that you've already reached out and established rapport and with people who could help. In the United States, one of those organizations is the FBI. So whatever the counterpart to the FBI on the government side is in your country that you're operating, make sure you've already talked to those and you've had coffee or beverages with those people and shared your concerns, and they've shared what their capabilities are and how to reach them in a time of crisis. Forecast, I'm saying the word forecast, it's out on the screen. Maybe I'm a computer. Make sure you've done the same thing with your commercial partners. If you have managed security service providers, make sure you don't just like check a box and say, yeah, we have them. Make sure you're close with them and that they're ready and on call. You know how to reach them and get their attention in case it's time to really, the you know what hits the fan. And lastly, we do this a lot with the folks we train. You might think of this too. Lots of companies partition their expertise right into cylinders of excellence. And so there's the cybersecurity people, right? And who knows what they do. And they're taking care of the PCs or whatever. I think the operators, the engineers and operators that are overseeing the processes, the critical processes, those folks do not need to become cyber experts, but they need to understand, back to that only the paranoid survive concept, that if something starts acting funny or looking funny, it could be a failure, could be some part is broken, something may be misconfigured, But I just want them to have the impulse to know that this could be something on the cyber side and to quickly call in the folks that have the expertise so they can at least investigate it. Don't always assume it's equipment failure. It's possible there's somebody else in the machine and starting to operate it. So get at least that thought into the operators' heads, and they don't need to go much further than that, but that's a good place to start.
And Andy, I think the advice you give are very valuable in terms of managing risk. And that's why I switched to forecast, because I think Jerome and I will be able to add to this after. But the idea is that everybody has risk. There's no risk. If you're a small startup, you may not make it financially. If you're a SME, you may have too many fixed costs for whatever's happening right now. Every single business is facing different risk. So what we don't want to say, and Andy said it very well, is we're not trying to scare the business. We're trying to identify the risk that must be discussed legally speaking at the board level. It's not a question of finding an answer to everything. If I can't, we all can't. If you can, let us know. It'll be great. It will greatly improve the moving forward how we work. But it's a question of working together with your expert to find a solution that is reasonable. And that solution often starts with identifying what's sensitive, what's critical to you, putting your effort there, and then growing and growing and growing. So that in theory is the best way for you to be able to protect the risk. Now, be careful about, like you have your compatibility, you may have open door on the way. And that's when we were talking about IT convergence. You want to make sure that the doors that are open have a security guard. Now you're going to decide, is that going to be a camera or is that going to be a person? You have the choice. But you may not react as fast if it's a camera, and you may not have the same accuracy if it's a person. All of these choices need to be justified, documented. And then the idea is for the board, for the officers to be able to come, whatever happens, because that's your job. You have to pretend that you can have to go to court, explain to a judge why you made that decision, why it's reasonable. And before you go to the judge, you go through way worse, and that's insurance. You'll have to explain to your insurance why you followed reasonable practices. And if you did not, you will find it very difficult to keep insurance at all. And that is the prime concern. You need insurance to function. You need insurance. You need to have a certain level that puts you above negligence. And that level does not require you to be perfect. So what's ahead for the mining industry in terms of cyber risk? I would say is everywhere. Cyber risks are multiplying because when it comes to the mining industry, you'll see it become intelligent. Well, I see the same thing in my house. And then I just moved to, I've been to Mexico not long ago, and I was just traumatized trying to talk to my car. I said, can you start? And it stopped starting. And here it's not automated, right? So you see the difference in terms of how much you automate, and that's when you realize how much you automated in your house and how much you might have created a bigger attack surface. You may have created more threats. So it requires being able to prioritize, but requires being able to do it with the right vision and understanding. Now, the last thing I want to focus on, to leave Jerome a last word on this, is assuming all of this fails. We come to security incidents, we come to business continuity incidents. What would be your top 3 practices that you would suggest are specific to critical infrastructure and they should think about it? Something they can Google tomorrow morning. We all know the NIST guidelines. We all know the 5 phases. The question is, what do I do if I have sites everywhere? What do I do if I have people on sites? Are there anything particular they need to go and ask their business continuity or security incident department in terms of, are you doing your job well?
Yeah, so I'll start with that, Vanessa. I think when you start looking at companies and saying, hey, where do we start? Change is the most constant in any organization, in any industry that we work a part of. And so the ability for the organization is, number one, to understand, what is their adaptability to changing in their operations. I think at the core of it, when you really work hand in hand, it's really beyond understanding where you are, what your risks are, what do you need in order for you to identify those risks, is really being able then to understand, okay, but once I have solved that problem, what are the tools in my toolbox today? And do I need to either improve on that or do I need to add to that? I think along with that, you should also, the question they need to ask is, what data am I able to get today? What is the information that I am aware of today that I can be able to act upon that's actionable, and be able to know that I can also then be strategic as I move forward? You know, when we start to look at a lot of the reports that have been out there, on average, most critical infrastructures today, and even though there are some that are more advanced than others, they still have a very difficult position to understand if they've been compromised to some level of degree. And beyond understanding if they were compromised, then how they're able then to respond to that compromise, it's also something that the industry is still challenged today in terms of how do we respond in the toolbox. You know, when we talked about convergence of IT and OT, that's been something that's been very interesting in many industries, because oftentimes it is the OT part of the organization that owns all of the assets, or manage majority of those assets, and trying to change the culture for them to understand that there needs to be a conversation about when change and transformation and sustainability starts to occur, that the only way that you can have any level of maturity in your organization is through making sure that you have created the controls that's necessary and show that there's integration. And between the assurance and integration piece, you're now able to move to what I call innovation. We can't continue to do manual site walk downs each time, because the minute you do that site walk down and you leave, the next day it's already changed. So how we're managing the changes in our organization and in adding automation so that we can increase not only technological efficiencies, but be able to increase the ability to manage our risk profile, our cybersecurity, and make sure that it's all integrated, so that it's not just a separate component, but ideally, we are now as an organization really including that as integrated in all processes, as well as making sure that we're designing it towards that. So that when we think about when we're building something, we automatically see that as an important function. Just as much as SCADA is important to us, security should be just on that on an equal level.
And I have a question for all of you. Please don't fight. Do we need more information sharing? Is there something that is in place between this critical infrastructure? Is it working? What do we need to make it work? Is it an issue with threat intelligence, treaties? How do you see the international collaboration with regards to risk to mining industry and, I would say, critical infrastructure at large?
All right. In other sectors, in the United States and in Europe, at least, there are information sharing organizations called ISACs. ISAC is the acronym. And their job is to stay in touch with their community and their members, develop those relationships that I was just recommending earlier, and to be on the lookout with threat analytic capabilities that they can then share with their sector. They're often sector specific because the particular attacks of attacks, the types of attacks, and the types of equipment and processes, it does matter that they give sector specific guidance. And so I don't know, maybe Ron or Jerome are aware that there is such a thing for mining, but there are certainly things for electricity, for oil, natural gas, and a variety of other types of sectors, industrial sectors, where they do have a central collaboration point for sharing threat information and mitigation.
And I do see a lot of progress. I mean, if you type mining and cybersecurity 5 years from now, you would have get almost nothing. Now there is a discussion around it. There's certainly some leadership that's being created around it. What do you forecast and that's for any of you, please feel free to chime in. What do you forecast in terms of maturity in that industry? I think we have different systems. I know we have old systems, so it's not necessarily easy for anybody, but do we expect to see standards, associations? What do we expect to see in the future around cybersecurity in the mining industry?
Good question. Good question. So Andy alluded to the ISACs being one of the ways to get information out there. I think mining is going to kind of proverbially have to get a jump start and accelerate a lot of the concerns for a long time. And this is from when I wore a product vendor hat more so, is we always looked at mining as a place we'd love to sell to, but they had no money. So that has had repercussions, especially because the way many different types of mining organizations are subject to environmental concerns these days and environmentalists. And so they're very cautious about sharing information. And I understand that. But oil and gas, maybe because they had more money or not, they started talking about this over 2 decades ago. And so you'll have to see, to remain competitive globally, mining accelerate their adoption of certain things for big expenditures to be put into place to upgrade infrastructure. You will see many new things coming forth. One of the things that you've probably started to see, I mean, this CSF is great and all that, and even if you use the ICS supplement, but you're seeing the ISA, International Society of Automation, ISA, produce the 62443 standards. You will see that in your products now that you're going to buy. So that's great. You've got something to tie yourself to. You'll see those bigger profiles being built out by the ISA organization for mining, and you'll probably want to start ingesting those into the way that you do business for your governance. And that's, again, a good segue for Jerome. But those pieces, those organizations, those standards, they're already coming at you. It's just a matter of getting the commitment to try to remediate all of the risks that you've unconsciously inherited through the many decades of owning these assets or buying these assets, and getting them closer to a place where they're engineered better for today and to tomorrow. So I'll kind of end there, but I do think the information is coming. It'll just be less of a closed door experience than we've been traditionally seeing.
Yeah, I do feel like we're starting to see a discussion emerging. It's interesting to see the leadership around this. It's interesting to see that there's more and more talk. I mean, we're here together today. It's a good start. And what I'd like to know, because I'm so lucky to have the 3 of you on the call, I'd like to know what's your closing word? Where are we going? What are your best advice? Maybe you can make a joke if you prefer to do that, but I would encourage you to give some nice advice. I think what we're looking for today is it's something that is more concrete. There's a lot of buzzwords. There's a lot of things that are written that say all kinds of number. There's very few very specific advice that can be done. And I'll take that back from a legal perspective after, and I'll add what I can add to it. But I'd like to know, based on your practice, what do you do in life? What are your actionable outcomes you can give away to our participant today? And I'll start with you, Jerome.
Yeah, sure. So interesting enough, we're seeing a lot more mining customers asking the question about cybersecurity and really taking a hard look in terms of what programs they need to start looking at and implementing. I think the best advice I would give for any client when we're sitting down and trying to resolve a problem is understanding what is the problem we're trying to resolve first. Because oftentimes when you start talking at the board level, excuse me, at the board level, then you go down to the executive level, and then you go down into the engineering, you tend to see that the discussions changes, the priority changes, and the way they're looking at solving the problem also changes. And it is imperative that we have board involvement to the point where previous examples where we've had boards actually held themselves accountable to certain metrics and requirements, so they themselves, if the company overall didn't meet those objectives, they also were held accountable as a part of that. So I think there is a level of accountability, particularly in the governance structure, that you would have to start creating. number one. And then I think number two is really starting to create awareness in the organization. Because mining as an industry, as a critical infrastructure, has an impact. And oftentimes when we sit down with those engineers, they really are trying to make the connection in terms of what they do, how that impacts others, and trying to give them an education and awareness. Helps to push and change some of the culture so that they too can embrace it. Because, you can have one segment of the business really pushing towards cybersecurity, assurance, hygiene. But if you really don't see that and being embraced throughout the whole organization, you still will have challenges moving forward.
Thank you, Jerome. Ron, your turn. What are your top 3 key takeaways?
So depending on which hat I'm going to wear, if I were to put myself in the asset owner's shoes, don't get lost in the over analysis piece of this. There's lots of issues going at you. If someone gave you a vulnerability analysis report and it's ever growing and it will continue to ever grow because security is a function of time, don't get lost in the paralysis. Don't throw your hands up and say, I don't know what to do. Start somewhere, make a decision. There are, as Andy said, concrete things you can do to focus on making measurable improvement. There are ways to think about cases from your what your bad day would look like and kind of hone in on that. And we deal with this every day. So it's just an extension of applying with what you do. I mean, I live in Quebec, so I drive a car in the winter. Well, what does that mean to me when it snows? Yes, I take on the risk that someone could hit me every day, or I could wind up in a snowbank. That's for sure. And that's going to be true when you buy technology and you implement it. But I can take steps about it. I can, make sure it's secure in my garage. I can put good winter tires on it. I can drive slower. I can reduce my routes to those that are cleared for buses. Apply the same thinking to cyber, and you're going to get a lot more bang for your buck. And simultaneously, while I'm thinking about, there's a new law, no new gasoline vehicles will be allowed for consumers in, I think, 2035 now. Well, guess what? I'm already thinking about what happens when I'm not allowed to have this, or the costs don't justify my current purchase. And so I'm going to start linking with an eye on the future towards what my next investment is going to be to replace that current one. And so I recommend taking that same pragmatic approach to cyber and to engineering and the way you do processes to be very real world based. And I think you'll get a lot of leverage on that, but also it'll work its way into a wider audience, much more than talking about the bits and the bytes and that vulnerability versus this one. You'll get something more functional and a wider audience that it might be an agreement to make action. So that would be what I would end on. Cyber shouldn't be scary at all.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we're so focused in what we do that we think that the industry has only our risk on their plate. But, it's the daily life of board of directors to have risk on their plate. That shouldn't come as a surprise. Maybe it's been there and it's been cooked different. You haven't seen it, but the plate has always been there. And it's not making the plate bigger. It's maybe moving things around. So I think it's not a question so much of saying that today there's more risk as a business, but a question of saying that today these risks may have shifted differently. And we expect the board, we expect the officers to shift with them and understand them so that they can follow and they can always stay within that range of reasonable business decision when it comes to IT. Andy, how do you see that? What would you like the top 3 things, takeaway you'd like everyone to remember today?
Thanks, Vanessa. And I think Jerome and Ron's closing statements and the guidance they gave is really apt. I'm not going to try to improve on it. Instead, I'm going to open another door. And who knows, but it's not going to be another conference topic at some point. It is in other venues, and that's the physical risk of climate change. It's starting to have extreme weather, and sea level rise is starting to have an impact on energy systems that I try to protect, my colleagues try to protect, and it's certainly impacting other infrastructure elements as well. So much depends on where in the world we're talking about, but there's hardly any place in the world that's not being affected. And as temperatures rise, that affects equipment. It affects human performance. As droughts, not enough water, or too much water in terms of monsoons and atmospheric rivers happen, we're seeing catastrophic results. And the insurance industry is super tuned into this. because they have to pay out. And militaries are tuned into this because it affects future conflicts. Credit ratings firms are tuned into this because they're trying to ascertain a particular organization's vulnerability, susceptibility to physical risks from climate change. So I think I said, I promised I try to not be an alarmist. I'm not trying to be alarmist. I'm trying to be realist, pragmatic like Ron, and say, if your organization is not tuned into that yet, it's another thing like cyber. It's another new risk on the block for many people, especially old timers. But it's something you want to be leaning into instead of surprised by when it actually hits you or hits you pretty hard. So there you go.
Thank you, Andy. And these are certainly insightful. I think I'm going to add my own perspective to this, which, and maybe you've heard this before, but data is a double sword. There's a cost to obtain it, there's a cost to protect it, and there's a return to have it. The first question is it worth it? Because if you want to get if you want to get data on your remote site, on what's happening into your machines, on the equipment data, on the equipment health, there's a cost to this. There's an acquisition, there's a maintenance, there's a cost to maintain the security of this. Is your return really worth it? That's your first question to ask. It's always supply and demand. If you go with no, then there's no reason to go forward with that technology to begin with. So it's always a question of what that data do you really need to operate. Some company right now are just getting any data just in case. That certainly is not necessarily the best option. There's a lot of question that comes with data. Who owns them? Who maintains them? Who makes sure they're accurate? Can I do data modeling with them? Can I do derivative work? Do they become to the equipment manufacturer or me? There's a lot of concern that goes around this. And unfortunately, every legal department is construed based on the usual industry legal issue. And that's not the data for them. So it's a lot of legal expense to figure that one out. And very often we feel like there's no end game to it either. It just feels like, it seems like I should get it because it seems like my competitor's getting it. So we have to be very careful about finding the ROI, which allows us also to put the expense for cybersecurity at the right place, because some of these new data sources that we were unable to get before can be critical even to the environmental changes, as Andy mentioned. Some of the new sensors that you can find in for example, fiber optic cables are able to help you reduce your capacity on the energy. So you can use the data to lead to something else after that is maybe very positive. Maybe you have a big ROI on this. Maybe you can protect people. But if you're just trying to make efficiency for efficiency's purposes, then maybe you need to rethink that the ROI may not be there, may not be there today, maybe in the future, but that maybe is not a priority. And then I would say the whole idea of contract management and procurement needs to be reviewed. Again, this is an industry that is largely composed of professionals in the mining industry. These are not IT people. These are not IT lawyers. There's a lot of cost and thinking that goes into managing this, doing the procurement. I have seen RFPs that did not even mention cybersecurity whatsoever. Or never mind the privacy of the individuals using the equipment. When are you in the site? What are you doing? Drones going over you. We're in the middle of a shortage of employee here. Maybe system thinking is what should be used. So technology needs to serve the users, the company, the society, and not the opposite way around. It is not a oil extraction of data. Not all data are good to have. They come with a lot of responsibility once you have them. And if you can access them, then at least one other person can access them, and that's a provider. And then that just opens the door. The other thing is make sure you have good contracts. You want to make sure there's no back door. You want to make sure you have technical support. Maybe you need to have on-site technical support in the middle of nowhere. Can you do that? And how much time? What's the SLA? What are the representation, the warranties? Because vendors can put a lot of things on their website, but if the contract excludes any liability after, then yes, there's a representation, but there's nothing you can do about it. And these systems are very expensive, costly, and lengthy to deploy. So once you find out that your contract does not protect you in case everything goes wrong, then obviously it puts you in a situation where you have to justify why you put all that money down the toilet, right? Because now there's nothing we can do. We can certainly search for something but that's going to be a lot harder than if we had it solved in advance. Think about dispute resolution. Think about business continuity. Think about working with them and forcing them to work in the ecosystem with others through contractual provision. Think about taking that contract and not just putting it in the first drawer, close it, and never look at it again for 5 years. We work very hard to give you mechanism like this. Use them, work with the other people in your industry, because once the incident comes in, I get phone calls from people I've never talked to before. I get a lot of suppliers that didn't even know they had this client in the first place. And by the time we figure out who's who, why, and what's happening, the delay for notification that I find in contracts when the law is long past. So it is critical that if you want to build an intelligent system, if you want to be more efficient, it goes through partnership, collaboration, networking, and obviously risk management. So I hope that covers, I saw some questions in the chat. I think I've answered all of these. But if you do still have questions, I know it's maybe nobody wants to say out there, hey, I don't have all of this in my business. What do you think? Completely understand that. Just know that we're there to help. We're happy to respond to your question. We're happy to follow up in a more private manner. But I think the overall message that you're getting for different industry experts with different type of practices is that risk management can certainly not be something you can avoid. It's unavoidable right now. You're opening the door of your house and it's standing there and you have to walk into it. So I trust this is helpful, and feel free to reach for any question.